There's a reason the entire world runs toward the US dollar. But what's even more interesting is that this power didn't happen naturally. It was built, and maybe in a way most people don't fully understand. Now, let me ask you something. If the dollar is no longer backed by gold, why does the entire world still use it? That's the question that changes everything. Because to understand this, we need to go back in time, all the way to 1776, when the United States was just being formed. And the truth is, the beginning wasn't impressive at all. In reality, the country was broke. No strong currency, no structure, no credibility. It was chaos. Each state operated almost like its own country. Foreign currencies were everywhere. Debts were rising, and there was no real system. Now imagine trying to build an economy like that. It simply doesn't work. And that's when one of the most important figures in this story appears. Alexander Hamilton. He saw something that most people couldn't. Without trust, there is no money. And without reliable money, there is no strong country. So in 1790, he proposed something bold. The federal government would take on state debts. In other words, he was unifying the financial system and creating something far more important: trust. A year later, in 1791, the first Bank of the United States was created. And for the first time, the country started to show signs of financial organization. But here's the thing. That didn't solve everything. In fact, the next 100 years were full of financial chaos. Crises in 1837, 1873, 1893, banks collapsing, people losing everything, and a system that was incredibly unstable. It was like the country was growing, but its financial system was always behind. And that created a massive problem, because a strong economy cannot survive without a stable system. Then in 1907, everything reached a breaking point. A massive financial crisis hit, banks collapsing one after another, people rushing to withdraw their money, panic everywhere. And here's where things get interesting. The system wasn't saved by the government, it was saved by one man, J.P. Morgan. He used his own fortune, organized private bailouts, and stopped the entire system from collapsing. Now think about that for a second. An entire country, depending on a single banker. That was a wake-up call. And it made one thing very clear. The system was too fragile. So in 1913, something changed forever. The Federal Reserve was created, America's central bank. The goal was stability. But in reality, it gave the government enormous power. Control interest rates, regulate banks, and most importantly, create money. And that completely changed the game. Because now, money wasn't just tied to something physical. It was tied to decisions. Soon after, the world went to war. World War I. Europe collapsed financially. While the United States did the opposite, it grew, produced at scale, sold goods to countries at war, and most importantly, lent money. The U.S. went from being in debt to becoming the world's creditor. But in 1929, the system collapsed again. The Great Depression, one of the worst crises in history. Millions of people lost everything, and the government had to act. In 1933, President Franklin D. Roosevelt made a drastic move. He banned private gold ownership. Gold became centralized under the government. Now think about what that means. If the government controls gold, it controls money. A few years later, the world entered another war, World War II. Europe was destroyed. Again, entire economies collapsed. But the United States came out stronger than ever, richer, more industrialized, and more influential. Then came the most important moment in this entire story. 1944, the Bretton Woods Agreement. At that moment, the world made a decision. The US dollar would become the global currency. Other currencies would depend on it, and the dollar would be backed by gold. This created something incredibly powerful: global trust. Because now, the dollar wasn't just paper. It represented gold. And that turned the United States into the financial center of the world. But then, everything changed. In 1971, President Richard Nixon made a decision that shocked the world. He ended the gold standard. The dollar was no longer convertible to gold. It became a fiat currency. No backing, only trust. Now think about this. That should have been the moment everything collapsed, but it didn't. The world kept using the dollar. And this is where one of the most strategic moves in history comes in. The United States made a deal with Saudi Arabia. Oil, the most important commodity in the world, would be sold only in dollars. Now everything starts to make sense. If every country needs oil, every country needs dollars. That creates constant global demand and keeps the system alive, even without gold. And this is where real power is born. The United States gained a unique advantage. They could print money, and the world would absorb it. They could fund wars, expand their economy, and influence other nations. The dollar stopped being just money. It became a global power tool. But this system has a cost. Debt keeps rising. And rising! Crises happen. 2008, the global financial collapse. 2020, massive money printing. And the question becomes harder to ignore. How long can this last? Today, we're starting to see changes. Some countries are trying to reduce their dependence on the dollar. Gold is gaining attention again, and new alternatives are emerging, like cryptocurrencies. The system is still standing, but for the first time in a long time, it's being questioned. Which leads to a deeper question. Is the dollar strong because it has value, or because people believe it does? Because in the end, every financial system built on paper depends on one thing: trust. And when trust changes, everything changes with it. The dollar didn't rise by accident. It was built, protected, and over time, imposed on the world. But the real question now is, will this empire continue? Or are we witnessing the beginning of its decline? If you want to truly understand how money works, subscribe to the channel, because here, you learn the real game.